Hi,
And welcome to the Career Coven. I'm Bec,
and I'm Annie.
and today we are talking about assertiveness, something that I think neither of us have a particular problem with, but I know that lots of people find their approach to assertiveness challenging and perhaps some of the connotations of being assertive. So let's unpack it. What does assertiveness mean to you, Annie?
Yeah, it means expressing yourself or your opinion in a way that is clear, direct, constructive, but not rude. And I think we will get into it. But as you said, lots of the connotations of women being assertive seem to be like, am I going to be bossy? Am I going to be difficult? Am I going to be rude? And I think, like, to me, I don't associate assertive communication with being rude. I just think it's direct, forthright. It's a way of communicating your opinion or a belief and kind of, yeah, expressing what you need or want.
Yeah, there's a lot of value judgment based on assertiveness, and society kind of implies that it's a bad thing culturally when you're just advocating for your kind of view or preferred outcome. And perhaps, there's like good situations in which you could be assertive. If you're being assertive about a good idea, that's a great thing. Or perhaps if you're being assertive about something that's more controversial or less popular or that people don't understand, that's when people might trip into finding that behavior a bit more challenging. One of the things about assertiveness that's particularly important for women, I don't know if you've read a book called The Authority Gap by Marianne Sieghart. It's brilliant. We'll put it in the show
I
notes.
haven't
But
read that one.
she talks about a double bind that women in particular face around confidence and assertiveness. So they're not the same thing, but in order to be successful, you need to be a combination of confidence and assertiveness. But when you are a woman, that means that you can often be perceived as being that difficult woman, and then
Mm,
women feel like they have to go the extra step to compensate for that and be also therefore overly warm and kind of
yeah,
compensate with a
yeah.
lot more softness and all of that kind of stuff to make people feel more, I don't know, neutral about the person.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I may not always be assertive, and like everyone, my confidence waxes and wanes, but I'm definitely not overly warm. That's one thing I can totally confirm, that I do not adapt my style when I think I've been too assertive or anything like that to being overly warm. But yeah, I mean, I think it showed in the questions that we got about this. It was really, really clear. There was such a concern about being difficult as a woman, about being bossy, and the perception of assertive behavior in the workplace, probably from all genders, but like definitely for women, the connotations are quite negative. I think for men, the connotations can also be quite negative, which is like they're aggressive, they're cocky, they only care about what they want. But it's some of those attributes are still seen as a positive for men in certain environments. Whereas in general, I think the way people feel about the labels that are sometimes attached to assertive behavior, like bossy, difficult, challenging, um, aren't seen as really positive when it's women doing it, which I think is something that hopefully is changing, but is definitely there. And yeah, I think it's good to start by saying that confidence and assertiveness are not the same thing. You know, you can have a kind of inner confidence in your own work or your own beliefs, but not express what you need when you need it. And I think that that is the difference, maybe, or the nuance between those two things is like assertiveness is actually being able to kind of say what you think in environments where it needs to be said in a way that is direct, clear, concise, gets your point across, and probably like isn't like overly emotional, overly personal, or anything like that. Whereas confidence in it is a separate like category. I can think of loads of people who I would say, well, not loads actually, but I can definitely think of a few people who I would say I think they actually are quite confident in their own skills. But what they really struggle to do is when they're in a large meeting, or they kind of need to perform, or they're challenged on their views, they struggle to then be assertive in those moments about explaining why they think these certain things and like why they have these beliefs.
I think that's really interesting. I've definitely seen in a lot of the women that I have managed that crossing that threshold from being having inner confidence about something to externalizing that and pushing forward and advocating for that is the kind of delta to bridge. I wonder if some of the things that hold those people back are perhaps a fear around vocalizing that position, or a fear of criticism, or um, something like that, as well as the perception that they might be leading towards that they might be being difficult. But
Mm.
certainly, if there was a piece of advice that I would want to give to anyone I was managing about being able to kind of move up in their career, it is also about being able to push for the outcomes that you think are the right ones, and doing that in a kind way, not a nice way, but a
Yeah.
kind way. But being really clear about that, and that kind of advocacy of what you think is right is really important, particularly in a dynamic where there might be some debate. And actually, healthy debate is part of healthy culture and healthy business, because there will always be a bit of conflict and disagreement because people have different objectives and priorities. But being able to kind of stand up in that environment and talk the talk, I think, is pretty important.
Yeah, and you're not going to be able to progress quickly if you kind of can't assert yourself live in meetings. One of the things that we've talked about in the confidence episode, I think it was actually, is everyone has like a significant probability of kind of being wrong in their opinion. And actually, people kind of challenging that is good. And if you're not afraid of your opinion being challenged and you know why you hold your opinion and you're open to discussing it, then being assertive is a lot less hard. If you feel that you're in an environment where you are going to be heard, people are going to like respect what you say, then you're more likely to just be being assertive and you'll probably listen to what's coming back at you because you're just expressing yourself in the moment. Whereas if you feel like you're in an environment where you're either under attack with like aggressive communication style directed towards you, or you feel that you are not being heard, that you have made your point a number of times and you are fed up with having to make it and make it over and over again, that's when I think, in terms of style, you can see people moving from assertive to getting really kind of stressed out, frustrated, and starting to actually, unfortunately, go from assertive to aggressive. And we've all done that, that's fine. And it's not a nice environment to be in when you don't feel listened to. And I think especially as like quite young women, I would say this happens to me like pretty regularly. But
Mm.
actually now I sort of see it as like, if people really aren't listening to me, that is kind of their loss.
Yeah, and I think that's also like the hallmark of respect for yourself as well, not to kind of lower your behavior to the common denominator of whoever you're speaking
Yeah.
to, just because you feel like that might be more effective. Although I think you raise a kind of interesting point around how your assertiveness probably changes with who you're talking to and the style around
Yeah.
that. Like, I'd argue that assertiveness is actually more broadly one of the tools in influencing, and
Mm.
there are other tools in influencing people to the outcomes that you want. Assertiveness is one particular style, but there are other ways to go about getting your point across where you don't necessarily have to be directly pushing a particular message really overtly. I would say there is definitely an argument in some situations for a bit more subtlety,
Yeah. Agree.
particularly when you're trying to land some really difficult messages. And you can be assertive about some things, but it's sometimes really helpful to let people talk through some of the positions that you're holding in language that lets them connect the dots between it, to
Agreed.
then help everyone get to the same conclusion, rather than you kind
Yeah.
of going straight to the end.
You definitely don't want to be being really, really assertive about everything all the time.
Okay, so let's talk about scenarios in which being assertive is the right style to employ.
Yeah, so I think you can be quite assertive about your story, like your personal story, the things that you have done. I think you'd be pretty assertive in job interviews, for example, or if you're asking for a pay rise, which is probably a topic that we should cover.
Always
Um,
be assertive in the pay rise
Always be
negotiation.
assertive then. I also think that when you've done a piece of work and you've formed a really kind of nuanced and considered opinion, and maybe you are more of an expert than some people in the room, I think being assertive about the conclusions that you've drawn because you are confident in them is a good thing. You know, that will give people confidence in the work that you have done. Um, I think if you're fundraising, like, which is a very specific thing, but lots of people do it in some way, shape, or form, be confident, back yourself, be assertive about the things that you have learned and the things that you haven't learned and the things that you're looking at trying to learn. I think that is an environment where both confidence and assertiveness are very, very highly valued and highly rewarded. And I also think being assertive, if you quite strongly disagree with something that has been said or a behavior that you have seen or a kind of value that really crosses a line for you, being very assertive about those, you know, I have always found that that has been more successful if you really communicate like that's crossed a line for me and this is why. um
I totally
yeah,
agree with that. I mean, you and I had very similar lists on this. I think for me, I would always be assertive if something felt sort of morally wrong, ethically
yeah,
wrong, against my values. It's also really important in situations with like bullying, harassment, discrimination. There is
yeah,
no space for being around the bush when you're talking
no,
about those
agreed.
kind of behaviors, and calling out something that needs to be addressed. That's not something that you can be really, really soft about. You have to be extremely clear.
And I think even where it's like, you know, a matter of perception, like how something was perceived, you know, I do think it is important if you perceived something as really affronting or like wrong, that even if the intention wasn't that, which is often the argument that will be kind of given back to you as the intention wasn't that, it is important to say, yeah, but the perception for me was very real, it was very immediate, and it was this, and you have to kind of understand that. And yeah, saying that in a way that isn't assertive, it just won't be listened to, unfortunately, in these like harder, more nuanced debates.
There are so
I,
many microaggressions that come out of people just being like, I didn't mean it that way, and or like just being
yeah,
a bit ignorant, and actually being really straightforward in those scenarios and just saying, it doesn't really matter how you intended it. This is the outcome of what you said, and perhaps you should reflect on that. And as someone who has line managed situations like that, the best thing that you can do for anyone involved in that situation is to be really clear, to say to the kind of person who
yeah,
received that, like, I understand that that was horrific. I'm really sorry. I'm going to go away and do some things about it. And then going and dealing with the person who had said those things to say really clearly, that crossed a line, that was inappropriate, here's the procedures that we're going to
mm,
follow. And there's no space for not being direct, I think, in those situations.
yeah, I agree. So, where would you not be assertive?
mm. I
I mean,
think,
you are pretty assertive. You're probably the most assertive person I know.
yeah, I am. I actually struggle not to be assertive. I have to be really selective about holding my tongue. There are many times where I want to express an opinion that I just don't, because I know that it's actually not going to get a good outcome or be heard or received in the way
Yeah.
that I intended it to.
Yeah.
So I'm quite selective about the hills that I'm willing to die on, for my
Mm,
assertiveness, and then I will go 100% on those. And when I choose not to be assertive, I think there is quite a lot to be said around whether you have the cover and authority to be assertive in a work
yes.
context. Because if you don't have the backing of the people above you or your investors or whoever that might be, and you might be speaking a bit out of turn, I would say you need to swallow that and perhaps look at getting that cover and authority before you push that. I think a lot of that is around, is it the authority that you have, or whose authority are you borrowing to make that point? But and sometimes that is perceived authority or it's real authority, but it has to be the
Yeah.
perception of the recipient of that um,
Yeah.
assertive behavior, that they have to think that that authority is there. So I think that is one time where I would also not be assertive if I don't have a clear view of a particular outcome or objective to achieve. So it's kind of like just being a bit Aggie for Aggie's sake.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just do that when I'm hungry, but that's never intentional. And then I would also just say, I think we'll probably not talk about this today in a huge amount of detail, and this might be something for a different episode. But when you're in the way that you manage your team, I think there's a lot of
Agree.
nuance around your level of assertiveness and
Yeah.
authority. And I would say if you're just being assertive with your team to demonstrate that you're more senior than them, I'd say that's going to go down like a bag of shit.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. I would say that there are definitely times in leadership where you need to be assertive, but there are also times when you need to like show humility and like listen. And I would say that humility and listening is more often than like being really assertive.
Shall we talk a little bit about some methods to be more assertive and some tips around those? I think
Yeah.
I would say you touched on this earlier, but in being assertive, sometimes it's just asking a really straightforward question, and it doesn't have
Agreed.
to come across in a tone that feels really, a bit too much for everyone. It can just be, can I just clarify
Yeah.
who's responsible for this and in what timing expectation will we receive it? It's something like that.
Yeah. Bloody love a clarification question. Bloody love one, you know?
Yeah, and I think also the so I often in a work context where something quite complex is being discussed and everyone is walking away with a slightly different interpretation of it. It's really helpful to just say, my understanding and takeaway from this meeting is that we're doing X, Y, and Z, and this person will be picking up that action and will regroup in this timeline. Can I just check that everyone understands the same thing? Um,
Mm.
and saying something like that takes your kind of, I don't know, it almost takes your interpretation out of it, because you are getting consensus around that, rather
Yeah.
than just saying, I think this is silly and I think you all don't get it. Comes across a bit
Yeah.
differently.
It's not assertive to interrupt people. It isn't. Like, um, you have to try and make space in conversations for your voice, and that can be really hard. And potentially, in some rooms, avoid interrupting people will be unavoidable. But overall, I think like people who are really good at being assertive and clear and calm do not interrupt or talk over other people to get their point across. I think this is like maybe too kind of literal in your terms of like tips, but I think trying to speak quite slowly, trying to establish like what your opinion or position is, trying to share in a concise way your main thought processes that got you to that point, to like show you're working. And then also in that establishing what is fact and like what is opinion. And I think the most important things are, for me anyway, like if someone like really aggressively interrupts me in it and communicates in a way where they don't seem very calm, they seem really kind of agitated, I just stop listening. And
I
I
mean, I
just
just end the call. Like, I'm, I'm like, I can see that you're not being your best self right now,
yeah,
or I can see that you're a bit upset by this conversation. So I suggest that we just reconvene at a later
yeah,
time when we can speak
yeah,
more
exactly.
clearly
Which
about
is,
what's
by the
going
way, a
on.
very, very assertive way to handle things going wrong, is to say like, actually, we're not going to get what we need today, so let's just stop it. Like, but you're not being rude, you're not being mean, you're not being unkind to this person. But like, I think many people do conflate being aggressive to get your point across with being assertive. And if someone crosses the line into it's interrupting, it's shouting, they look really annoyed. Sometimes they lean forward, like I am now, like lean forward into the
Get
camera.
a
It's
little
like,
finger.
okay, I mean, if someone pointed a finger at me, I would just hang up. I wouldn't even say anything. I'd just be like, sorry, what the fuck was that? But you know what I mean? Like once you start to see those behaviors, you're no longer going to think about the content, and you're just going to feel on edge, and you're going to think, this person is now being aggressive towards me. What is going on? Are they okay? Blah, blah, blah. But you no longer get like the point that you're trying to get across. It just completely ruins you trying to be assertive because you've lost yourself to something else. And that's the one thing where if you get so worked up, like if you are personally listening and you're trying to be assertive and you're trying to kind of work up to like having your voice, but you are so annoyed, then I would suggest just saying something like, I disagree and I'll follow up with you afterwards. Because if you cannot express yourself in a way that is constructive, my tip would be don't try. If you're really heightened, like don't, maybe that's not the right tip, but like, you know,
No,
it's
I
more
think
likely
you're
to go
right.
completely wrong. It's more likely to go completely wrong, isn't it? If you're so frustrated, you're like boiling over, and you just want to tell them all to fuck off. The best thing is not to kind of probably not to tell people to fuck off, but also it's not to like throw all your nuance and all of your work out the window and say something that expresses that really you're very annoyed. Don't try feels a bit like of a wrong thing to say, but it's like try another avenue,
Yeah,
try in a different environment.
I think, you're talking about an environment in which there's probably not a lot of psychological safety, and in any kind of normal work conversation, you want to be able to have the time and space in that discussion to listen to what they're saying, think about it, and then respond. But if you're just reacting, you're going to have a really difficult time at being effective at getting to the outcome that you want, which is really the objective of kind of being assertive. I think you also raised a couple of good points there. There was one on which made me think around being assertive for the sake of your ego versus being assertive for the sake of the outcome. And
Mm,
I'm always kind of really outcome and accountability driven. But if people are being assertive because they want to be assertive as part of their ego, that's when you're going to end up having a really unproductive
yeah,
conversation. The other thing that I think is quite important to talk about is the timing of being assertive.
mm,
There, and this is perhaps less in the context of a project or a working group, but more in terms of being assertive about what you want for yourself. So, for
yeah,
example, there might be a list of like 4 or 5 different things that you want for yourself in a work context, and maybe that's a promotion and a pay rise and to go to this conference and to do this thing or whatever. And I have found sequencing and prioritizing the asks that I want to assert for myself with my managers to be the most helpful thing. Because if you give them a laundry list of demands, that just comes across as
yeah,
actually just annoying. I hate
yeah,
receiving a laundry list as well. It's much more effective to sequence the things that you want to push forward in
yeah,
terms of
100%.
priority, and also like what is realistic and what is the person who is going to be granting these things to you
Mm,
actually able to do, and like what's within their gift and their timeline. So it is quite important, I think, to for people, if they are advocating for themselves, to kind of think through how that might play out. And one
yeah,
thing that I think a lot of more junior people who've probably not managed people before don't realize is that when you ask your line manager a question about like when am I going to get a promotion, or
yeah,
you have those development conversations, it is not like the click of a button and I can give you a
yeah,
promotion.
exactly.
It's
Yeah, it's not always.
unbelievably complicated, and there's
Yeah,
like 3 months of like dealing with HR stuff and finance and
yeah,
budget approvals. So I think a lot of people don't recognize that normally, and then they say, well, I asked them 3 months ago for a pay rise and I haven't got one. And
mm.
without sight
And
of
that's
so many of those barriers that happen internally
yeah,
after that.
Yeah, and I think, I was very late in my career when I realized how hard it could be in a bigger organization to promote someone or to give them a pay rise. Um, because I'd always worked in these kind of smaller, less structured places. But the other thing is, behind all of this process that managers have to go through is some logic around pay and progression and fairness and the way the company works, and like, trying to make sure that people aren't just promoting on preference, and I think it is on the manager to just explain to you or to people when they ask for these things that these aren't just simple gifts to give that are completely within your control. The processes are there, they can take quite a long time, and they are actually there because of an attempt to make things equal. I'm not sure that always works, but that is the rationale for all of this. But let's go into like a really practical situation, bit of role play perhaps, which
Okay.
is like, how would you advise me, if I'm just about to go into a pay review, to be assertive without coming across as aggressive, unreasonable, bossy, difficult? What would you advise that I do?
Okay, so you're in a company and you want more money.
Yeah, I've been there 2 years. I've been at the same level. I've been frozen on a pay. I've been frozen at like 50K and I want to go up to 60. And I've heard that people in my team, potentially some men, are paid 70. So I'm actually only thinking that I'm going to go into this asking for 60 because that's what I want. And that's what I think is realistic. And, I've only been there 2 years. What would you advise? How should I prepare for this meeting? How should I approach the conversation? How do I be assertive without coming across as demanding?
Okay, great question. So I every time I go into a pay negotiation or help other people with pay negotiations, there are a few things I always do. First is that you look at market rate.
Mhm.
And that might be different if you've already been in the company for 2 years. You'll be off market rate probably by then. But it's always a good understanding.
Below, do you think
Yeah,
below market rate or
no, for
just,
sure. If
yeah,
you've been
agreed.
in a
Yes,
role for 2 years, you're already below market rate for sure.
totally agree.
Um, so understand what the current market rate is. I If your colleagues feel comfortable telling you their pay, that is a very useful data point to have. I can say as a manager, sometimes it's a bit annoying when people talk about pay because it creates a whole headache. But that is also your job as a manager to unpick the headache, even though you might not cause the headache.
Would
And
it come across, do you think it could come across as aggressive if I presented my two male colleagues 70 grand salary?
I don't think it comes across as aggressive, but I would also, if I were the manager, I would be thinking, um, is there anything else that explains that discrepancy other than their gender?
Yeah.
Could possibly be. But if I were this person going into that meeting, I would also be leading with my performance and say,
Mm,
here are the things that I've done in the last 2 years. Here are the things that I've achieved for the business. I think I'm accelerating my progression, and I understand that I'm actually one of the lower paid people in this team. And then I would also look at, if you're in a corporation that has pay bands, I would say I'm in this pay band. Like, what percentile am I in? So, am I at the lower end of that
mm,
pay band? Um, if you know the pay band information, you know what the upper limit will be for what your manager
yeah.
would, in theory, be able to do. So you already know the range that you're looking at. And then I would also, um, I think it really depends on how important this is to the person. Let's say it's really important. I would just say, I really love working here, but we've been through cost of living, inflation has been bonkers percent. I'm actually just, it's really important for me to get paid more. I think that's a hygiene factor for my role. I would really love for you to be able to do something about this. I would hate to start looking at other options. I really don't want to do that and I want to make this work, but I would love for your help to do that. I think that's probably how I'd approach it. Is there anything you do
I mean,
differently?
I would give you a pay rise off that last speech. So logical. No, I think the good thing about like leading with your performance and leading with what you've done is that usually that's pretty factual. Like people don't argue with you led a project, you did this outcome, and you can stand behind your own work with a lot of confidence and be assertive about it without it feeling arrogant. Like it isn't arrogant to talk about what you've done factually and say this created business value and I would like to be fairly rewarded for that. I think it's still uncomfortable for a lot of people. I don't want to pretend that it's easy, but there is something easier about looking at a set of facts and
Yeah.
talking about a set of facts. Like it's not really opinion whether you did this stuff. You did do it. It's there. People know you did it. And I think that that's a really good starting point to make your case for whatever you want, whether it's a pay rise, whether it's to go to a conference, whether it's, progression or a job title change. Where I think it's much harder is just like I sort of want a pay rise because I've heard other people are getting one. I've never had anyone present something like this to me, to be honest. Like I've never really had someone have like a really terrible pay discussion with me. But I can imagine that it does happen because some people find it incredibly hard to talk about their own achievements and therefore will avoid it and will look to only anchoring them at their colleagues or only anchoring them to the market. And that's quite a weak argument without you being assertive about your performance, I think.
I've
Because just looking
definitely
at,
I've definitely had a number of people I've managed who have
have
just
you?
thought, yeah, and like there is just nothing that I can or really should do in that scenario if I'm being really blunt. Like if someone is not a high performer, I'm going to have to go and do backflips for them to go get a pay rise. And I've had people I've managed where they have threatened to leave and say, "Oh, this job is going to pay me 60K more than I'm on now." And I'm like, amazing. I'm so happy for you. Congratulations. Off you go. Like I'm not going to be able to match that. That's obscene.
Okay, so one thing I'm really curious about, because you're the sort of back from episode 2, you're the boundary queen. How do you think assertiveness relates to boundaries? And do you think that um, when a boundary is crossed, potentially you are more likely to move from assertive to aggressive?
It's a really good question. So I think you should always just be assertive about your boundaries. And if anyone hasn't listened to episode 2, we spoke about this a lot, but it's just being really clear about what you are and aren't willing to do, and what feels right for you. I think when a boundary is crossed, I mean, a boundary exists because you get cross if someone crosses it. Like I
Mm.
get cross when people cross my boundaries, and I always have to take a moment to step back and try and respond rather than react to it. It is potentially where you're veering from being assertive to perhaps some of the shadow sides of assertiveness. Um, I also think it's probably unfair to react that way if you've not really communicated the boundary. If people aren't
Agreed.
aware that it's an explicit boundary, and it's a boundary that you formed in your head and told no one about, um, they
Yeah, assuming knowledge,
yeah,
assuming that someone knows that they've just really crossed a line for you without having ever kind of expressed that that line exists is quite hard. One of, I think, the most challenging points in to be assertive is when you're dealing with scenarios, meetings, people that are actually quite difficult and may like cross your boundaries quite regularly and quite a lot. And one thing I think can be helpful with being assertive but not aggressive is assuming positive intent, even when it's really, really, really difficult to. I actually I don't think to the point where like that can be weaponized against you. Like I don't think you assume positive intent all the time and everyone gets away with everything for it. But I do think that in the majority of situations where someone is being really quite aggressive towards you or really quite authoritarian or maybe just clearly finding something you are saying quite hard to process, assuming that they may not understand, you may have crossed one of their boundaries, but that they're not actually attacking you. They are just threatened in something that you have said, I think an is a tip or a way to kind of keep yourself quite calm and therefore on the side of assertiveness and not aggression. Because certainly for me, when I think about when I haven't been assertive, but I may have been, what other people would have perceived to be aggressive, I don't think it's very often for me, but it would be when I'm finding a particular personality consistently, repetitively, incredibly hard to deal with.
Sometimes the difficult person isn't being difficult for the sake of being difficult with you. Like they have other stuff going on. They're being triggered by something. Something is happening in their home life.
Okay, let's go to the questions because we had loads.
Let's do it.
There were some themes. So we've potentially covered this, but maybe as just 5 tips from you, Bec. How can you come across as assertive without appearing as being a difficult woman and or being bossy and or being aggressive?
Okay. I I don't mind being difficult. I
Amen. Me neither.
I'm sort of fine with that. I think, well, like if you think about what makes a woman difficult, it's probably a woman that stands up for herself and challenges the status quo. And like, I'm on board. I'm on board with being difficult. So I would just encourage the listener who asked that question, and I'm sure there are many other listeners who have thought this as well, to just feel a bit more comfortable about being a challenger and being a disruptor. I think they're cool things. Um,
Reframe them.
yeah, reframe. I like it.
Yeah.
Add to it. Bossy is just a silly word. I'm fine with being bossy too. I think being bossy is about actually underneath. If you take the connotations out of it, it's just about having authority and clarity.
Probably wanting to get things done,
Yeah,
wanting to actually see things happen. No bad thing.
yeah, accountability. That's a great word, and we love those things. So again, I don't really have a problem with being bossy either, but I'm going to try and answer this question in the way that the listener intended it, which was, how do you?
Tips.
I suppose these are tips for tempering your approach to being assertive, to not stray into a higher spectrum of assertiveness.
Yeah.
So I would probably just think around, is there a neutral way that you can phrase what you want to say that doesn't come across as being, self-interested? I think a lot of these things come across as being self-interested.
That's good. That's a good point. Neutrality, tip 1. I
Yeah,
like it.
neutral language. You could also tip 2, just ask it through a question rather than say it.
Agreed.
Get other people to say what you're thinking. Then they always think that it's a good idea. That's really helpful.
Lovely.
In terms of being aggressive, I would probably just be on a vigilant watch for your tone. And I don't always get this right.
Tone and body language as well. I think body language gets forgotten a lot. Like if you sound fine, but like you are really close to the screen, or you are like gesticulating kind of quite aggressively, or like you know, I think there is body language cues that can also be really impactful. And yeah, one thing I would also say is like amongst your work friends who are in these meetings with you, or people that you really trust, one way to like sense check your tone if it's not something that you can self-regulate is to ask for feedback in meetings, like just after meetings with someone you trust. How was my tone in that? Did I come across as annoyed?
Yeah, and I would add one more, which is actually just your face. And I say this
Oh
because
my God, yeah.
I'm really bad at this, and I wish I was better at it. And I thought I was actually pretty good at it until there was a particular meeting that went down in history as like maybe one of my worst meetings ever, where I had to rewatch the recording because we couldn't get consensus on something, and it was quite a hostile meeting. And I thought I was chairing it quite neutrally. And as I watched the recording, I just watched my face of thunder through the whole thing, and I was like, "Oh, okay, we'll work on that one." So just think about your face.
Yeah, that's a good one. My first ever bit of feedback professionally was someone just told me to change my face.
Oh, you've got such a
And I
lovely
was
face.
like, it doesn't feel very constructive, change your face. It doesn't feel actionable. It doesn't feel time bound. It doesn't feel specific. You know, everything I was expecting feedback to be. How does assertiveness promote constructive change?
I love this question. I think underscoring assertiveness, and this is why I actually really like assertiveness, is a kind of driving forward of something. It feels like there's action behind it. It feels like there's momentum with it. So I actually really associate assertiveness with constructive change. It might not be
Agreed.
that constructive if you end up in like a massive row with someone, but you would hope that the outcome overall of you asserting whatever it is that you're advocating for does lead to constructive change. So I actually think that's a great question. It's bang on. I think it's actually probably difficult to do constructive change without being assertive. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that yeah, there will be someone being assertive to promote constructive change in an organization. Um, so yeah, I find the two are kind of inextricably linked. I would agree. I think that also, as we've discussed, like on particularly important issues, things that you feel really passionately about, you know, moral issues, like being really assertive about them can create like so much power and so much influence and really accelerate change that might have taken years to happen in an organization
Oh,
as well.
totally. I love that. And I feel like this is a really amazing bit to kind of finish the episode on. It's just around like social change and
Mm.
challenging widely held
Change.
positions that have like inequities in them and pushing for those and advocating for those. And you could definitely not get the same amount of progress without being assertive
100%.
and being, and it is about challenging the status quo, but sometimes it's even just like educating people around, this is what's
Definitely.
happened, this has been discrimination, this is what I expect to change, and
Yeah.
doing that in a really effective way, I think is so magical. So also big ups and thank you to everyone who does social change. It's such a magnificent field to be contributing to.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more. The only last thing I want to say before we end is some people put some quite weird words in these questions. It wasn't just bossy. Some people put things like soft, you know, that they wanted to be assertive but also be soft. I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel like don't fucking waste your energy trying to be soft. You know, women have enough natural, unavoidable characteristics, and there's enough shit from the patriarchy to lead you to being categorized universally as soft and weak and, you know, small. But like, don't try and be soft at work. Like, I don't know, kind, yes, 100%. Sensitive, empathetic, yes. None of those things are the word soft for me.
I think if you tried to be soft and assertive, you just wouldn't be assertive, and you wouldn't be pushing for the things that you want. So I think there's also a whole spectrum of yourself at work, and you're not ever going to be 100% assertive 100% of the time. I think I'm probably
Agreed.
actually assertive like 1 or 2% of the week,
Yeah,
and the
it
rest
would
of
be
the time.
very tiring. It would be very tiring for most people to operate on high levels of assertiveness for more than kind of, I would say, 5 to 10% of the.
I would agree with you that soft is a bit of an odd word to hold on to as an aspiration.
Yeah.
I would,
Don't
I would,
aspire to be soft. Don't aspire to keep soft. No. I think we want to leave soft for like furnishings, don't we? Like, oof. Anyway,
I just think that if you're soft at the expense of being assertive, you may find progression and um, and driving forward the things that you want much more difficult than you would be if you just stopped caring about being soft. Because I think you're if you aspire to be soft, I'd assume you're naturally quite a gentle person. So you are
yeah.
you are naturally probably already like that, and that's okay. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Thanks for making it so far into the episode. We are so grateful you are here, and we are so grateful for all the feedback that you've been giving us on
Thank
our
you.
little poddy adventure. We've got new microphones today. Thanks for all the audio
Thanks
feedback.
for all the sound feedback.
Amateur hour over here. Thank you. No, we are very grateful. You will be able to find us now on Spotify, Google, and Apple. So wherever you have found us, please like and subscribe, and maybe give us some 5 stars. That would be so nice. It helps other people find us. All right. Thanks so much.